start to identify how these proteins cycle.
And estimated that by the middle of the century,
actually makes your stress hormones go down faster.
Welcome to Brainwaves, a podcast about big ideas produced at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm Andrew Sorensen. I usually executive produce this show, but I'm filling in on hosting this week while we explore summer, or as it's known in the West, wildfire season. The sound you're hearing is a controlled burn in Boulder County in 2016. But we're hearing about more big wildfires across the country the last few years. We're likely to see more this year, and that's not a coincidence. So why is that? How much is it costing us? And what can we do to slow down the destruction? We'll also get an update on what wildfire season will look like this year, and why the wet winter could mean explosive trouble for parts of the western U.S. We'll start with how big the problem is. In the last 10 years, the U.S. has spent more than $18 trillion fighting wildfires. That's according to the National Interagency Fire Service. And in 2018, each fire the federal government pitched in on was more than 4 times as expensive as the ones a decade before. Brainwave's Dirk Martin has more on why.
Take a guess. What's the biggest day for wildfires in the U.S. every year? The answer? July 4th.
People started 84% of our wildfires in the last 2 decades. Are they really wild?
That's Jennifer Balch talking at a conference late last year. She's an assistant professor of geology at CU Boulder and director of the Earth Lab project, trying to better understand Earth based on the information we're getting from satellites in space.
My own work shows that fires have increased in the western U.S. by 350% since the 1980s. We spent $3 billion last year fighting wildfires, and we suffered $18 billion in damages.
She says a warmer, drier climate, more fuel, and more ignition sources are costing us.
In the western U.S., there's been a 2 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature. Snowmelt happens about a month earlier, and we consequently have a fire season that's about 3 months longer.
That's the drier climate part. Balch says we're also adding fuel to the fire.
We farm, we build cities, we introduce invasive grasses.
Like cheatgrass, which Balch says can double fire activity.
1.8 million homes today are at high fire risk. And the wildland-urban interface, which is where homes intermingle with flammable vegetation, is expected to double by 2030.
As a part of fixing that, Balch sees a future with nationwide fire risk maps and a lot more crunching of satellite data to better predict where and when fires will happen.
That takes us to what we're doing about wildfires, and some of that hinges on what we consider to be big fires that we should be doing something about. For that, we turn to Brainwave's Cole Hemstreet.
the U.S. Forest Service defines a megafire as any fire that is bigger than 100,000 acres.
That's Michael Kotis, author of a book called Megafire, The Race to Extinguish a Deadly Epidemic of Flame. He's also actually fought fires. He says there's some debate over that definition.
We have lots of small fires that destroy a lot of homes, kill people, put resources and infrastructure at risk that are probably a lot more mega than those really big fires that burn in remote wildernesses.
A big part of the problem, Kotis says, is the United States forest fire policy for the past 100 years or so. It's called the 10 a.m. policy. Basically, any wildfire should be out by 10 a.m. the next day.
It doesn't take great skills with math to figure out that if you put out every fire for a century in a forest where you had fire clearing out brush and deadfall and competing species every 2 or 5 years, you're going to have exponentially more fuel in that forest after a century.
Some of those forests, according to Kotis, have 40 times more trees than they did historically. And as we've talked about, more people are moving into the path of danger. Kotis says as many as 1/3 of American homes could be in the path of potential wildfires, and he says many of those communities aren't built with a lot of this in mind. Enter the Camp Fire, in and around Paradise, California in 2018.
In the case of Paradise, you've just got a couple of roads that go in. They're windy mountain roads that are very difficult to travel when they're smoked out and there's fire on either side of the roads. And the population has gone from, I think, somewhere around 7,000 people to, getting closer to 30,000 people.
85 people died. There are some things we can do to help, Kotis says. One is planning these communities properly. with more roads in and out. We should also be making sure homes are fire ready.
So, building with a metal roof rather than, a shingle roof, having special vents so embers can't get inside the house, and clearing all the land or, managing the land around the house so that you don't have needles collecting in areas to allow an ember to ignite the home, and the trees are limbed up and thinned.
Some people have floated the idea of increased logging. Not a great solution, says CODIS.
The big trees that are valuable to timber operations are the trees that are resistant to wildfire and make a forest less prone to burn really significantly or really fast.
Though other experts have another solution. Dial back the clock to when we had thinner vegetation in wildfire areas with controlled or prescription burns.
But it's very difficult once you have a community in that forest to convince people that either we should let a natural fire burn and do its good work for that forest at a time of year when it's not risky to let it burn, or to allow foresters and firefighters to go in and start a prescribed burn in which they would intentionally burn that forest to mimic what natural fire would do to that forest. It's been really difficult to do that.
For Brainwaves, I'm Cole Hemstreet.
Now let's take a look at what all this means for the here and now. It's been a wet winter, and that could be a big problem. To explain why, let's talk to Brian Henry. He's part of a team at the Bureau of Land Management that predicts how bad wildfire season is going to be. So Brian Henry, what does the forecast look like for the western United States, basically wildfire central for the United States, going into the summer of 2019?
Interestingly, this year, it seems like as you take the West as a whole, it's going to be pretty much an average out to be a very average year, which has actually become the exception because most years have been much more active than what we have seen in the past. Now, that being said, there are some focus points that we have been keying in on that raise concerns for us, one being the Pacific Northwest, mainly from the Cascades west for a change to the coast, and then also across parts of California in those middle and lower elevations where they have a lot of grass growing there. And they've gotten a lot of rain in California, so they're growing a lot of thick grasses and dense grass crops and so on and so forth. So when that stuff dries out and cures by mid to late summer, there could be some problems there. But there are some areas that we feel a whole lot better about this year than in previous years, one being the higher terrain in general, from Colorado all the way through the Great Basin and even into the Sierra in California. Snowpack over the winter was well above average, and the snowpack is coming off at a slower than average rate, which is a good sign. So those are some of the brighter spots. Other things that we're looking at we're trying to evaluate what's going on with drought across the West. And if we were to look at the drought monitor that's issued weekly, you'll see a map that is about as free of drought across the United States as you'll ever see, with focus points being mainly just across a small section of the Pacific Northwest and some residual stuff down there in the Four Corners from the previous year's drought.
So yeah, very wet winter. Sounds like not just in the Rockies there, which have had pretty much record snowfall, but also on the West Coast there. What's different between the Rockies and the West Coast, particularly that Pacific Northwest and kind of the California area, where that California area is a concern, whereas the Rocky Mountains not so much?
It's been all about the weather patterns from the late winter through present. Along the Canadian border, say from Glacier National Park in Montana west through Puget Sound, their snowpack was actually below average this winter and into the early spring. And they've also had some very warm, high-pressure ridge events, which have helped melt off that snowpack very quickly. But it's very much an anomaly when you look at the other area as a whole. And something that's been very interesting about the West, especially as of late, we've had a lot more of these wet, low-pressure systems moving across that are also very cool. And we're in the midst of having a pretty big pattern change currently that's going to really last for about the next week and a half, possibly 2 weeks, to where you have these successive wet and cool systems moving in from the Pacific, bringing some rain and even some mountain snow.
With that wet spring, it's the Pacific Northwest going to, bail themselves out of more wildfire risk, or are they still kind of looking down the pike of a potentially rough season there?
It's going to linger a little bit. What's going to happen with this weather pattern that's coming in? They were heading towards a very early start to their fire season. They usually don't start seeing significant activity till late June at the earliest, but they already were starting to have some fires west of the Cascades already. So with this pattern that's changing, that's coming in, bringing all this moisture, this is going to kind of give them like a temporary reset that will allow for them to have a more of a normal entry into their season. But the effects of that drought up in that area and the dry soil moistures and the dry fall that they had last year and the below average snowpack, that will still be felt, but it'll probably be more so as you get towards like the 1st of July and getting to August, which is traditionally when they have their core fire season. So when it does get ready to burn up there for the fire season, it'll burn very actively, and we are expecting an above average fire season up there.
With the massive fires we saw in, I'm thinking about the Camp Fire out there in California and a few others, are we at risk of seeing that same kind of thing this year, and why or why not?
That's always a concern that's in the back of my mind, especially in lieu of watching that fire from my office here in Boise, Idaho. I was looking on the weather satellites. You could see the fire spreading very rapidly. I am concerned about that because we do have such a good, heavy, thick grass crop that's growing this year across California. And as people continue to build into the wildland-urban interface, basically on the edge of the towns up into like foothills and things like that in the canyons, they tend to build into areas that may be more susceptible to fires of those kinds. So when it does warm up and dry out, and it will happen at some point in the summer, it's just that it's going to be a little bit later than it usually does, those fires could become, those grasses could become quite problematic for us.
Anything else that you want to add that people need to be paying attention to kind of as we enter fire season?
Just to be, I'd urge people to be cautious once you see those grasses turn brown and cure out and dry, especially during those really hot, dry days. And if there's any wind present, please don't even think about lighting any campfires or anything like that, because it could go very badly.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Brainwaves. I'm Andrew Sorensen. We'll be taking a week off next week because of the Memorial Day holiday, but we'll be right back here the week after. Dirk Martin produced today's show. Andres Belton composed our intro music. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe for more big ideas. We'll catch you next time on Brainwaves.